Thank you for joining us. My name is Brendan O'Reilly. I'm the president of the Press Club of Long Island. We are a chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And tonight's event is Navigating Ethical Pitfalls. This is an event geared towards journalists, but also anybody that wants to learn more about what journalists do and why we do it and how we come to decisions on what's ethical and what's non-ethical. And it can be thorny issue sometimes because it's going to vary from journalist to journalist and from newsroom to newsroom. There are some things that I would say most journalists accept as universal truths, but there's other things that get a little more hinky. Our guests tonight are Fred Brown, who is the chairman of the Society of Professional Journalists Ethics Committee. He actually wrote the book on ethics for SPJ. It's called Media Ethics, A Guide for Professional Conduct. He also guided the modern SPJ Code of Ethics. It's been updated, I think, 4 or 5 times over the course of its existence, and Fred had a large hand in the last time it was updated. He was formerly an adjunct instructor of media ethics at the University of Denver, and he previously worked for nearly 40 years at the Denver Post. Hi, Fred.
Hello, everyone.
And our second guest tonight is Denise Civiletti. And Denise is the editor, publisher, and co-founder of RiverheadLOCAL. She is newly a Press Club of Long Island board member as of about 12 hours ago or so. She's a veteran local reporter, editor, attorney, and a former Riverhead Town Councilwoman. So she's actually been on both sides of the media, on the reporting end and the receiving end. And of course, she's been recognized with numerous awards over her career, including for investigative reporting and Writer of the Year awards. I'm going to read off a few things that I found interesting from the American Psychological Association on ethical pitfalls. And this was from an interview with Anne Ten Brunsell, PhD. And there's a few ethical pitfalls which she identified, and I'll summarize them. Ethical illusions. People generally think they're more ethical than they are. Ethical fading. Euphemisms such as right-sizing and collateral damage can also contribute to ethical fading, as can the sense that ethics is someone else's job. Motivated blindness. We tend not to see the unethical behavior of others when it's not in our best interest to do so. And Dr. Ten Brunsell, she had also said in response to how do you avoid these pitfalls? The first step is to recognize that we aren't as ethical as we'd like to be, think we are, and aspire to be. The goal is not to get you to recognize, gosh, I'm not really good. It's to get you to want to use this information to be the person who you think you are, who you want to be, who you can become. These were general statements on just human ethics in general, but they definitely do apply to what we aspire to in journalism ethics. And what I want to lead off with, and Fred is the perfect person for this since he had such a hand in the Code of Ethics, is how do newsrooms reach a consensus on the most ethical way to report the news? And in SPJ's case, not just one newsroom, but innumerable journalists having to get together and agree that yes, this is the code that we want to abide by.
You know, there are 2 ways to go about this. One is to, first of all, come up with a code of ethics for your newsroom. And a number of years ago, the Denver Post actually brought in the Rosenstein and the other guy from, anyway, 2 professionals who had written extensively about ethics to help the Post write its own code of ethics. And then they did what more and more publications are doing and should do, and that is to post this code of ethics on their website so the public could, in effect, check them on it. A lot of attorneys will advise against that it's not you're just opening yourself up to lawsuits, criticism, whatever. But I think it's a perfect way to illustrate your transparency and your commitment to doing a responsible job of reliable reporting. And the second factor in ethics is really on a case-to-case basis. When a situation arises that you believe has an ethical question about it, the thing to do is to talk about it among your editors, the reporters who are going to be covering it, and have a discussion based around what the relevant facts of the situation are, who has to make the decision, what are the principles involved, and how are you going to explain it. And I think the more you can do this and make it public at the end of the process, the better off you are. One other thing I should point out, the SPJ Code of Ethics is aspirational. It is a voluntary commitment. If your employer has a code of ethics, you pretty damn well better follow that. Because if you don't, you're going to lose your job.
Hey. We mentioned right before the call that the SPJ Code of Ethics itself has actually been cited in lawsuits, and I'm assuming these are lawsuits over probably mainly libel. And
yes.
Second of all, I would think protecting sources. But can you think of an example that you could share of when the SPJ Code of Ethics has been cited?
Yes, in fact, I have been involved in a couple of cases where it has been cited as an expert witness. And I've always made it very clear that the SPJ code is non-enforceable, that it is a statement of generally accepted principles, but that doesn't mean that these are rules that journalists have to follow. The rules come into play when it's your employer's code of ethics that is being challenged or tested. The famous pink slime case in which ABC called a meat product that is really, well, I was asked if I had seen it and how I would describe it. And the attorney for the plaintiff said, wouldn't you say it looked like pink slime? And I said, no, frankly, it looked more like linoleum. It's a thin sheet of stuff that's spread on a drum and frozen and then scraped off. And the thing about it is, it's almost entirely meat fiber that is rendered from fat and other scraps that come off slaughtered steers. But anyway, that's one of the cases where the code of ethics was cited, and I was very careful to say, you know, yes, these are generally accepted standards, but they're not rules. A case that involved, well, I'm not sure if I wasn't involved in that case, but there are instances where something may be the ethical thing to do, but it may not be the legal thing to do. This was a case in Minnesota where a reporter was approached by a campaign manager for a lieutenant governor candidate when they were running separate and not as a ticket with the governor candidate, who promised to tell the reporter something if he would, something about the other lieutenant governor candidate if he would not say where it came from. And the reporter hemmed and hawed, said, well, okay, what are you going to tell me? And it turned out that this was a case where the other candidate, when he was a college student, had been detained on suspicion of shoplifting from a grocery store. But it turned out he didn't. And anyway, the reporter went back, told his editor that he had some dirt on the other candidate and told the editor what it was. And the editor said, that is nonsense. That's not a story. The story here is that this guy thinks it's the story. And so that's what they wrote. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the promise of anonymity is like a contract. And so the newspaper, which I believe was the St. Paul Pioneer Press, was found liable in that case. But to me, I agree with the reporter, or with the editor, who, by the way, was later editor of the Denver Post, who said that, we should expose what kind of nonsense some political operatives try to get away with and turn it into a story and hide behind promises of anonymity.
Right. Denise, do you run into these issues of the balance between protecting sources and wanting to give your reader the context of where information came from so the reader can decide whether it's something they should trust?
I mean, sure, because you run into that quite a lot, especially in politics. That's something that happens all the time. But I mean, I don't know about you, but I never really quote anonymous sources, or I don't really go there. I never really find that I have a need to do that. I will get information from people that is kind of like a lead of things to look into or look at, but I don't generally say a source who spoke on the condition of anonymity. I can't say I've never done that, but very, very rarely. And the flip side to what Fred was talking about is there times when things are legal but not ethical, in my opinion anyway. I mean, and you could maybe not be breaking any laws, and maybe even not be violating the code, or the aspirational code, but they're not necessarily the ethical thing to do. And it's like kind of like you said before, you have to work through everything in discussions with other people, and looking at all the different angles. I mean, it's particularly, I think, in your face when you're in community journalism like we are out on the East End here, and we're living in the community with people, and that adds another layer of complication in our lives and everyday reporting, I think. Because the folks we're reporting about are all around us all the time.
Yeah, I think there's a joke from like the news from Lake Wobegon, where he's quoting the editor of the local paper, and the local editor says, "I have to live here too." You don't want to go into the grocery store and run into somebody that you burned. So the teaching that I received about protecting sources was, like Fred said, it's a contract. If somebody says something to you and you agree off the record, it means that does not get published at all. If they say, "I'll tell you this, but you can't quote me," that's another way of saying, on background, then, okay, you could use the information, you can't say who it's from. Or maybe you negotiate, okay, I won't use your name, but say, like, can I say it was a senior administration official, which is, what they always use for the White House. And amazingly, everybody who's ever worked for the White House has been a senior administration official. But in local government, sometimes there's only 5 people who it could be,
We're talking about that today. Yeah.
So if we say somebody who's familiar with the matter said, it's like, well, who could that be? And it's very narrow. So like Denise said, I do like to just take that information and go verify it myself and not just rely on using it. And the other thing that I want to point out, because we use the phrase anonymous sources, there's this misunderstanding that the readership has that anonymous sources means the editor and the journalist doesn't know who it is. Anonymous means the reader doesn't know who it is. It doesn't mean that the journalist is just taking an anonymous tip. The journalist actually knows who it's coming from. We're not just publishing a blind email or a blind letter that we got that was unsigned. I joked about this event too before we got together, that in ethics, the people that probably need to be at this event are the ones who aren't going to show up. And the people who already care about ethics are the ones who are here. So we're kind of preaching to the choir here for everybody who showed up. I'm assuming that you're journalists and you have an interest in ethics and you already aspire to this. But then there's the people who don't care aren't going to show up for this. And the next topic I had on my list was plagiarism, which is one of those things that I identify as like, oh yeah, we all agree that's wrong. But Fred, if we could go back to you, is plagiarism something that we have to spend a lot of time explaining to journalists, or do you think that it's kind of like something they learn on day one and it's only rarely a problem?
You know, it's something they really should learn on day one. But I remember after the New York Times case of Jason Blair, where he was caught making stuff up, and it wasn't exactly plagiarism, but there were numerous cases of plagiarism that followed after that. That you would think that journalists would have learned their lesson, that you don't make stuff up, you don't attribute, or you don't borrow what other people's work and call it your own. So yeah, it is the one thing in the SPJ Code of Ethics that is an absolute. For the longest time, the only thing the code said about plagiarism was never plagiarize. That was amended in the 2014 version to never plagiarize, always attribute, which I think is a little clearer. But in any event, there are, like most of the rest of the code, in fact, all of the rest of the code is couched in language that is advisory rather than mandatory. You'll very seldom find, in fact, I don't think anywhere else will you find the words never and always, except in that one principle: never plagiarize and always attribute.
And Denise, do you have anything to add on the topic of plagiarism?
Well, I mean, in the context that we were talking about before with AI, do you think? I mean, that's,
Sure.
you know, we were talking about the use of AI in the newsroom, and the risk of actually plagiarizing other people's work, because the AI scrapes information and sometimes sentences wholesale from articles on the internet, you know, and you know, I mean, I wouldn't, certainly don't think it's right to use AI to write an article and put your byline on it. I think that's problematic as it is, but when if you should do that, and then you find that you're actually using other people's written work and plagiarizing, I mean, is that something that you need to do intentionally? I think it's really, that's another aspect of the use of AI in our work, which I think is going to be a problem if it becomes something that people do, if people use it a lot.
You know, as long as we're kind of veering into a discussion of AI, it occurs to me, and has occurred to me over the years, that there are stories involving a lot of statistics that probably could be written by AI, and certainly not with a byline on it, but for briefs, for maybe a stock market report. I mean, I remember reading stock market reports or stories, and they were pretty much formulaic. I think AI could handle that. And one of the things that maybe that would do would free up reporters to spend more time on long form stories that require more detail, more investigative reporting, and more that are actually more useful to readers, that bring in new information and aren't just simply stenographic kind of reporting, which I think is what AI can do. But I also think that if you're going to do it, if you're going to use it, you should alert your readers or your listeners that some stuff is written by a machine.
Right. I do find that with the risk of AI, there's already talk of copywriters, not necessarily journalists, but people who do ad copy, or they write blogs for websites that aren't relying on journalists, that all those jobs are going to be replaced by AI. Design is going to be replaced by AI. And we mentioned the plagiarism aspect. if you're putting graphics on your website designed by AI, that AI took from somewhere. So you might have plagiarized 100 different sources in order to make that graphic. And if any of them flag that, courts are kind of still out on whether you're going to be able to sue a website that stole your art to make a conglomeration of 100 pieces of art, or what if it's a conglomeration of 100 articles?
Yeah.
So
You can always say that's research.
well, what is the phrase that you know, you steal from one source, it's plagiarism. You steal from 10 sources, it's research. Or
Yeah.
And as you said, the idea is to always attribute. If you're using 10 different sources, attribute 10 times. Right. So conflicts of interest is something I want to get into. I mentioned at the top that Denise, you've been a councilwoman in Riverhead, and now that it's in the past, and the more removed you are from something, the less conflicts you have, right? But sometimes people are going from one job to another, or you live in a small town, or you work for a community newspaper. Sometimes you can't help that somebody is, you know, your brother-in-law, and you can pass off that story to someone else, which is easy to do in a newsroom with 100 people. It's less easy to do in a newsroom with 3 people. How do you deal with conflicts of interest in a way that you're able to function and do your job, but also not cross any lines that would make readers, you know, thumb their nose at it?
Yeah, I mean, I was a member of the town board in this town many years ago, like late 1980s, early 90s, and so that has receded. Although there are people that I cover who you know, look at that and say, well, you know, you were elected as a Democrat and you have a, you know, a partisan agenda, which I really do not. But they'll look at that and say that. But like just kind of sort of little things, even like I was a member of Rotary for a long time. And, you know, we would regularly cover Rotary events and write stories about things Rotary was doing. And if I wrote that, and sometimes I did, I would put a note on the bottom. I would disclose that I'm a member of Riverhead Rotary. And, you know, I felt like I really didn't have a choice. I had to cover the things that were going on in the community, and the fact that I was a member of that organization shouldn't, you know, prevent my publication from carrying a story about it. But I think it's important to be upfront and transparent about things like that. You know, but you know, it could get gnarly. I mean, then what if, you know, this had never happened, but you know, what if something went wrong with somebody in Rotary, and you know, at a club, you know, I don't know, misappropriated funds or something like that, you know, then that's a completely different situation, you know. And I don't think I would touch that one myself, you know, with a very long pole. Like that wouldn't be something that I would get involved in. I would pass that off to someone else. I'd find someone else that, you know, to do that. And I would still, I think, disclose even at the bottom of their story that the publisher, editor, et cetera, is, you know, a member of this organization. So, but it's, you know, I think, again, being in a small town and, you know, being on the ground, so to speak, in this type of journalism, you know, you run into those things all the time. I mean, you're reporting on things that happen to, and things that people you know, and things that people you know do that, you know, you have to report. And you know, you know, you lose friendships, and you know, there were many casualties as a result of that, as we all know. But it kind of comes with the territory. So.
And Fred, I want to ask you about another type of conflict, and to use a broad term, I'm going to use freebies. So say you're a book reviewer, you get sent a lot of books you didn't pay for. Say you're a wine reviewer, you get sent wine. Say you're a theater reviewer, you get comp tickets to go to theater. But on the other side, we have theaters that say, thank you for writing the article about this show. You know, it's not a review. It's like you say you interviewed a comedian or a musician that's going to come, and they say, well, thanks for doing the article. We're going to give you a press ticket. Should there not be press tickets? Are we doing something wrong by accepting a $50 or $100 theater to go to a ticket to a theater to go see a concert when we're not going to write about it after the fact?
I wouldn't do it. I think it does raise questions. In fact, the very idea of going to you should always pay for what you're reviewing. Unfortunately, that can't always happen in today's world where newspapers and other people are really strapped. I think it is, as Denise said, very important to disclose where the origin of the story, or if you're doing a review, you can say that, you know, we were given tickets to the show, and so we're writing a review about it, or we would have written a review about it, whatever, but it's still important to disclose that you got free tickets. And if you paid for them, you know, maybe you should say that too, because it is kind of rare in the business these days. When we were rewriting the Code of Ethics, or we did very little rewriting, it was actually just an examination with a few revisions. But one of the disagreements we had was from people who said that the whole idea of being independent is kind of difficult to follow if you're a freelancer, if you're a blogger, so that it's more important to disclose where your support is coming from than it is not to avoid that support. And we finally settled on saying that the the Code of Ethics did not say be independent. It said act independently. It still does say that. Disclosure is important, but it's also important to try to avoid getting yourself in a situation where you're going to have a conflict of interest. So I would say that is probably the best. If you can disclose where your funding is coming from or your support is coming from, do it by all means. We have a number of smaller online publications in Colorado have sort of adopted this new model where they get contributions from various sources, but they disclose that in their online sites. Usually, if you find something that says about us, that will tell you where their funding sources come from. In some cases, it can raise some questions, but at least you have done the right thing, which is to disclose that there are people who are making contributions to your operation, to your outlet, and that the best way for you to judge whether the conflict of interest is somehow affecting them is to read what they're doing or to listen to what they're doing. The true test of whether you're being influenced, I think, is in the reporting that you do.
I want to bring up social media use in the age of Twitter. We could probably all think of examples where we've seen journalists say things that we would not say in a public forum like that. And, you know, I came up when Facebook came out when I was in college, and Facebook was something that circulated among people who went to the same school as you, and eventually anybody in a college. But now everybody and their grandmother is on Facebook, quite literally, except the younger generations are not joining. They're on TikTok.
I was going to say, especially the grandmothers.
Right. So there was a time where you would go on Facebook and it was you and your friends. And I will say things to my friends I would not say publicly, because as a journalist, I keep things close to the vest about what I feel, because my personal views don't come into how I perform my job, which is the way that it's supposed to be, as the Code of Ethics says, and act independently, as Fred said. Everybody has opinions, and they have their own ideals, but to be a good journalist, you set those aside and just act objectively, which is the overarching theme of the Code of Ethics, I would think. But at some point, I couldn't be my personal self on social media anymore, because eventually you're not just there with like your friends. Now suddenly social media has become open up to your loose acquaintances, your sources, your, if you're friends with the mayor and you cover the mayor, you don't necessarily want to go online and say, well, here's what I feel about national politics, because maybe the mayor doesn't agree with you on national politics and now they don't want to talk to you anymore, or they see that you're biased in a way that, they think it informs the rest of your reporting. And as local reporters, I think there was this time where we could say, it's okay to have a national viewpoint because I'm not a national reporter, but I don't know if that distinction holds up anymore. And I still see journalists on Twitter every day opine on everything, or they share like very sarcastic memes that make light of serious situations and sometimes make light of one side of the argument and not make light of the other side of the argument. And well, now it just seems like they're an opinion writer and not an objective journalist. So Denise, if you could start, do you have strong feelings about this? When you have employees under you, do you tell them like, keep things to yourself?
I mean, certainly the things that we cover, yeah. I don't know, I really haven't had a conversation about like, don't express opinions about, national politics or national politicians, but I can say that the times that I did that myself, I regretted it very much, very quickly. I have qualms about even like accepting friend requests from like the people I cover. You were saying, like if you're friends on Facebook with the mayor, and I get these friends, and then I don't know what to do. Like, do I say I don't accept friend requests from, Mr. Councilman? Like what, I don't know what to do. I honestly don't know what to do about that. So I've just like accepted friend requests from everybody, and I have way too many friends on Facebook, and so I generally don't really go there anymore for the same reasons that you were citing. You can't be, just yourself, because now you're a public person in a public space, and that's hard. So
Yeah.
I think that I mean, certainly you should not be saying things about the people you're covering, and even like in a personal way about even the issues that you're writing about. Like, that's, I think, a line you shouldn't cross.
Yeah, I have known an editorial writer who, made his living doing opinions, who nonetheless was let go because what he had said online was regarded as over the line and unfair, and in some cases, even I think maybe profane, you could call it. But the Denver Post's Code of Ethics, which I'm pretty familiar with, even though I was not at the Post at the time the latest version was written, has a very long section on how its employees should behave online. It's probably worth looking up if you are interested in pursuing that. It is cautionary. It says, remember, if you're online, it's not, people know who you are because you have a byline. They will, whether you identify yourself as a Denver Post reporter or a Denver Post employee or not, they may very well know that you are, and you have to be not say things that you would say in your professional life.
And Fred, what do you think about selfies with sources, whether it be a source you see frequently or somebody you meet once. If I meet, you know, a former vice president and I'm like, well, that's cool. I want my mom to know I met the former vice president. Do I take a selfie with a former vice president who I interviewed for work on the job and post that to Facebook? Or what if it's Bruce Springsteen and I interview Bruce Springsteen?
Yeah.
Can I take a selfie with Bruce Springsteen, or is that inappropriate?
Oh, I would say it's slightly inappropriate, but heck, you know, one of the things you want to avoid as a journalist is what I think a former editor of the Chicago Tribune is credited with saying, that the First Amendment is not a license to be a jerk. And he may have used actually a 7-letter word instead of a 4-letter word. But, you know, we are people too. And I think we can be forgiven having a sense of fun and maybe a sense of humor too. But just don't let it get out of hand. Selfies, I would say, yeah, it's okay.
So I'm gonna start taking questions soon. So if you would like to ask the panel a question, please use the raise hand tool under the reactions on your Zoom menu. While those get queued up, I want to ask Denise a last question. Right to know versus privacy. I think this is something that can be, it's a struggle for all of us, particularly in community journalism, where things get really personal sometimes. And there's discussions that we have about if there was a suicide, you know, that has its own ethical implications because you don't want copycats. But say it was just a car accident and somebody died. We report on accidents. We tend to report on who died. We tend to report on who got arrested. Do we not name people when the family doesn't want somebody named because of their privacy? Or does the public have a right to know that somebody died in the car accident that tied up traffic for a few hours, and do they deserve to know who it is? And you know, we could apply this question to any time we write about anyone ever who did not ask to be written about. And sometimes I look back on things that I did and I said, maybe today I wouldn't have written that article because the public interest was not that strong. I could at the same time turn around and defend those, but I feel more like I can make the argument in the opposite direction too. How do you feel, Denise?
I think that things that happen in the public sphere, I think are public, fair game to report. I don't think you can, the barometer can be the family didn't want it reported, because if that's your measure, how do you, where do you draw the line with that? You know, a lot of people are not going to want a lot of things reported, but we have to report them. You could, you know, that could go with, you know, arrests and things like that as well. What we do is we take care to make sure that we're not reporting something or even putting a photo of an accident, you know, until we ascertain that the family's been notified, because who would ever, you know, you've got to put yourself in the person's, in their family member's shoes, you know, who would want to, you know, find out that a loved one died in a car accident by seeing it, you know, on a website or, you know, and again, you know, I mean, that doesn't stop everybody else from doing this. I mean, there are a lot of people that are taking pictures and posting to social media without that, you know, without that filter, without that sensibility and sensitivity. And we have to, as journalists, you know, have to live with that too. And sometimes get tagged with that, even though we didn't do it. So I think, you know, people have a right to privacy, but if things happen in a public place, or they do things in a public place, and you know, there's an accident and it shuts the road down, and you know, or someone's in a fight and, you know, there are injuries, and I don't, you know, those are matters that I think are, you know, there's news value to them, and that may be very difficult for us to report, but I think there's news value in reporting them.
And Julie Lane has our first question.
My question is a line between advertising and editorial content. Obviously, we understand that there has to be that line. However, we had a situation on the East End recently with a controversial subject on which there was going to be a referendum, and a lot of the ads were coming in that were just totally off base. I would get to see them. My editor told me I could make recommendations, which I did because it bugged me that so much of it was just straight lies. And in terms of my copy, I wrote what needed to be written and, you know, I think we covered it pretty honestly. But I guess I felt like if I owned the paper, I'd want to say, keep your money, I'm not publishing your ad, because they were so outrageous. Some of the ads were so outrageous. And is there a place for that? I mean, I would, as a reporter, I understand I wouldn't have that option to say, we're not going to take that ad. But I certainly I continue to be troubled by the idea that we ran so many ads that were just full of information that was incorrect and outrageous.
Fred,
I
do you
think
want?
you have a responsibility to make sure that things are factually correct and accurate, even though they're
Well-
ads. I mean, you know, you're presenting that information in your publication, and I know that we always did fact check ads.
I fact checked them, but at some changes were
rejected them.
made
I mean,
because
you
of
know,
things
every
that I
2
said, but
years
not
we're
all.
fighting with people. You know,
You know, I think that newspapers or anyone who accepts advertising should have policies written down and declared as to what they will accept and what they will not accept. And I'd always give you a place to go when you don't want to accept an ad that you know to be false. And of course, the other thing is apparently what you did, Julie, which is to fact check the ad and report it. Report what your findings are.
Absolutely, we did that, but still frustrates me to this day because of I mean, as it happened, the referendum passed in spite of the ads that were so inaccurate, you know, and with so many outrageous things. But it was very frustrating to realize that I didn't have control over saying, keep your money. I'm not, you know, if I owned the paper, I felt like that's what I would do, but that wasn't my decision to make.
I mean, that's why we
And
got rid of comments.
I mean, all we could do, you know, all we could do on the editorial side is write what we knew to be true and what we could substantiate and explain why, and run editorials on why we felt that some of these statements that were being made were inaccurate. But again, you know, it frustrates me that we couldn't just, well, I couldn't at least have the authority to say, keep your money. And yeah, I mean, I understand the paper needs money to pay my salary and to pay all of its other expenses, but it is frustrating at times.
We're gonna hop over to Peter. Peter has a question.
This is for Fred, and I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly. Were you saying that it's the policy of the paper not to accept free tickets to events for critics?
Yes, it is. At some papers it is.
Okay.
I'm not sure that in today's straits that is still the policy at the Denver Post, but it was for the longest time.
So the Denver Post did not, every time the Denver Post reviewed a performance of something, they had bought the tickets.
Yes.
That's interesting. It certainly wasn't it wasn't and isn't the position at Newsday, where I worked as a critic for many, many years. It's not the position at the New York Times. we couldn't cover things if we had to pay for, I mean, tickets to the Metropolitan Opera. I don't know what they cost
Yeah.
now, but I know that when I was going, they were $200 a pair.
Yeah.
We couldn't do it if we had to pay that. Now, I know that in sports, that the sports departments do pay their way.
Yeah.
You know, they
And
do have
that-
admission to the games. They do pay their way on, you know, when the team is traveling, things like that. But
I remember, you know, when I covered political campaigns, we would pay for our space on a campaign plane.
yeah. Okay, that's not what I was referring to. I'm referring to covering the arts generally.
Yeah, yeah. Well, things when you go to a show in Denver, it's not that expensive.
Yeah, but how much are you paying the reporters?
Yeah, well, actually, the newspaper pays for the ticket.
Ah, well,
Not
that
the-
would be, yeah, I also think that the newspapers in New York wouldn't pay for tickets for the Met or the New York Philharmonic
Yeah.
because of how much they are. And it's basically, it is an accepted practice. If you are reviewing, you get a pair of tickets, and they are usually among the best in the house. If you're an editor, if you're someone who is not covering it, then you shouldn't be getting tickets, although I know that editors do take those tickets. But if you are professionally involved, if your job is to go to an event and write about it, we couldn't do it.
Yeah, free tickets. Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a difference between a very expensive venue and one that is not that expensive.
How do you decide which one you're going to pay for and which you not? I mean, is there then going to be a
Well,
dollar limit?
For the longest time, it's just a general rule that if you're going to review something, the newspaper would cover your expenses.
Well, they cover the expenses in terms, not the ticket, but they cover other expenses.
Yeah.
I know that that's not the case in New York City.
Yeah.
I'm in the same boat, Peter, where if we had to pay for everything that we were invited to review, you know, the paper just wouldn't make money. The immense cost of tickets to go to things that these venues want us to go to, we could not keep up with it and still eat at the end of the week. And they are all very happy to have the press conference or the press coverage. So that's why they have ample press tickets to give away. And sometimes, you know, if there's a packed room and they're setting aside tickets for the press, they're losing money on those tickets in anticipation that the press is going to help them sell tickets in the future. And there's other times where the theater's less than half full. And if they give away 10 tickets to the press, those press people are going to warm those seats, but that theater didn't lose any money that day. So I think there's different ways to look at it. And books too, like we get sent so many unsolicited books. And sometimes we are asked to review books that were self-published. If we bought that book, we would be the one person that ever bought that book in the existence of its publication, because it was self-published and nobody was going to buy it until after we wrote about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the case. It's certainly the case with books. It's the case with records. I mean, I was getting recordings. I couldn't possibly even listen to all of them. And I know that my colleagues would have thousands of recordings. People were just sending recordings.
Yeah, and I think that's an exception. It's not, the Post had a book editor at one point who would take the books he had read and sell them at a used bookstore.
Yeah, I know that practice. Yeah.
And he lost his job because of that.
Yeah, what Newsday did is we sold it. We would have a fair and we'd sell the books.
Yeah, that's what the Denver Post ended up doing, was selling all of the freebies that people had sent in at around Christmas time to the public.
Yep.
And then donating that money to charity. But you know, in terms of restaurant reviews, you know, that's a difficult situation, because eventually everybody in town knows who your restaurant reviewer is. especially in a market like Denver, where there's, you know, maybe a couple of people who write restaurant reviews. And so you're gonna, whether the newspaper pays, whether they try to give it to you for free, you're gonna get treated differently from the average customer.
And Gregory has a question if you'd like to ask that now.
Yes. I'd like to ask Fred or Denise just an opinion on something. I listen to a lot of news radio here. In New York, we have WCBS and WINS. And what I hear periodically, and it makes me uncomfortable, and I'd like to get your feedback on it, is when I hear, and I'm not going to name any names, people probably could figure it out, but when I hear a business reporter or even news anchors reading commercials or promoting something, and to me, it just seems so inappropriate, especially in this market for an all news radio station to allow talent to be reading ads or to actually promote something that they've used. To me, it just seems like it's crossing the line, and I'd like to know your opinion on that.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, that makes me very uncomfortable as well. So credibility, I mean, you know, what do we have but besides credibility? To, you know, integrity and credibility, right? So
Yeah.
I read your book today, Fred.
I see it in the background there.
Yeah, I spent the afternoon with it, but it's true.
Yeah, no, it is a practice you'll find in broadcast much more than you'll find in print, because heck, nobody cares who print reporters are, but they do identify with broadcast personalities, especially those who are on television. And you know, I've known television. There's a former television anchor right now who does ads for a furniture store, but she's retired, and you know, anything to keep Bree on the table, I suppose. But yeah, and you know, I'm on the board of the Community Advisory Board of Colorado Public Radio, and a lot of their underwriters actually pay for particular kinds of coverage. Kaiser, for instance, pays for health coverage, and that is often disclosed in the reporting, as it certainly should be. Does it affect the reporting? I think the best way to judge that is to consider how fair the reporting seems to be. And I think that when you are covering a sponsor or a contributor, you certainly should mention that, which allows your listener or your reader or whomever to judge whether it seems that there's some influence there that shouldn't be allowed to happen.
I've heard the same kind of things on podcasts too, come to think of it, Gregory. You know, listening to a podcast, you're tuning it in, you know, stay tuned with Preet, and all of a sudden he's talking about some product that he's used and how he likes, and you know, and it always, it always takes me aback. You know, it just seems it seems wrong. I don't know. No, I'm not just picking on him, but I mean, you know, you hear that with podcasters doing that as well.
So, Fred, you know, the overarching theme of this was avoiding ethical pitfalls. And I think the advice we're leaving people with is that the Code of Ethics is a good place to start. How do you encourage journalists to make these decisions? There's an SPJ Code of Ethics, there's what their newsroom has as a code of ethics, and there's personal ethics.
Yeah.
And sometimes you might find that your personal ethics are more restrictive than your newsroom, or sometimes you might feel like your newsroom's being too strict. How do you think individual journalists go about making the right decisions that they can live with, and also journalists in general and the public at large are going to feel were ethical?
You know what I have always advised students is to ask the right questions, and you'll come up with better answers. And so the best way to think these things through is to talk them through with as many people as you can, and bringing in as many relevant factors as you can. And the people with whom you discuss it should be knowledgeable about the subject you're talking about, but it is very important whenever possible to have a discussion about an ethical problem to help you reach the right decision.
And doesn't SPJ also have like an ethics? I don't know if they call it a hotline, but like that you can reach out
Yeah.
and have conversations like that with other people.
Yes, it does. In fact, Rod Hicks is the Director of Ethics and Diversity for SPJ. It's R Hicks at RHICKS, one word, at spj.org. And there's also a part of the site, spj.org, is called Ethics Central. And
Yes.
that's where you can carry on a discussion.
So I've dropped the SPJ Code of Ethics link in the chat, so you can
Yep.
all take that, download it, bookmark it, sleep with it next to your bed. And my advice would be, of course, to read before you publish. Don't read it after the fact, after somebody's accused you of being unethical. We have more events coming up, like this conversation tonight, but on a variety of journalism topics. What we have coming up in March, on March 29th at 7 p.m. Eastern, is accessing public records that governments hold close to the vest. This month was ethics. Next month is freedom of information. That panel is going to be moderated by SPJ board member JD Allen, and the panelists are going to be Freedom of Information Chair for Press Club of Long Island, Carolyn James, Timothy Bolger, the editor-in-chief of the Long Island Press and Dan's papers, and Charles Lane, who is a reporter for WRHU Radio, and he is also with the Institute for Access to Public Information. I've been Brendan O'Reilly, the president of the Press Club of Long Island. We are in the midst of award season. If you have done great work in 2022 about Long Island, please enter it in the PCLI Media Awards. You can learn more information on how to enter at pcli.org. If you are a member of PCLI, you get your first entry free. That's a $25 value free. In order to become a member of PCLI, we don't charge anything. We just ask that you be a member of SPJ, since we're a local chapter. You go to spj.org and you follow the instructions to join. And when prompted to designate a chapter, designate Press Club of Long Island. We also come out with an annual media guide, which is a directory of every outlet on Long Island, whether they be digital, print, or broadcast. We give that out complimentary to our members every year just for joining PCLI. We appreciate having you here so much. We can't have these events without an audience. Fred, Denise, you've been wonderful panelists tonight. We appreciate so much you being here. Denise is on the east end of Long Island with me. Fred is coming from the other side of the country, but he agreed to be here tonight. So we thank you so much for that. Everybody who sits on this panel does so on a volunteer basis. So please join me in thanking them. If you want to turn on your cameras and your microphones and say goodbye and thank you now. We're going to close the room in a few minutes. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you, Brendan.